Moed Katan Daf Yud contains one Mishnah. First part of the Daf comments on our last Mishnah, and it defines a number of the terms which we've seen there referring to skilled labor like sewing, and the permitted ways and forbidden ways in which it can be done. And the Gemara will define what those terms are. And then our new Mishnah will talk about constructing and assembling certain items such as a mill, when it's permitted, when it's forbidden, and the Gemara will list a number of other halachas about things which one may do or one may not do on Chol HaMoed. So let's begin. The first thing we'd seen was that a skilled person and an unskilled person, meaning a professional or an amateur tailor, have different halachas as far as sewing on Chol HaMoed. So the Gemara says, what is the difference? How do you define a skilled person or an amateur? So the Gemara gives two ways of defining it. Rav Yanai's yeshiva said that a professional is someone who can draw a few stitches at a time. That means he runs the needle in and out of the cloth, but he leaves the stitches loose, and then he pulls with one pull and tightens them all. The other explanation comes from Yossi Bar Chanina. He says that somebody who can sew on an even hem, that is a strip of cloth which was sewn on the bottom of the cloak in order to keep it from fraying. If he can sew it on evenly, he's a professional. If he sews it on unevenly, then he's an amateur, and they have different halachos. Now, one of those halachas was that a professional cannot make professional stitches. He has to do it in a way called machlev. The Gemara says, what's machlev? The Gemara says it's unprofessional stitches, obviously, and it means either stitches that look like steps or stitches that look like the teeth of a dog. So steps would be if they're spaced apart. They're not in an even, they aren't one following the other. There are gaps between them. And like the teeth of a dog would mean that they're uneven. One is higher and one is lower on the line of the garment, like the teeth of a dog, which are uneven. They're not of even length or growth point. The Gemara now moves on to discuss the structure of the supports of a bed. The way the bed worked was that it was a frame with ropes strung across it that would hold up the person sleeping on it, or the mattress that he would put above it. So how do you install these ropes? What type of work to install the ropes is permitted and what's forbidden? So the Mishnah had spoken about misargin, which everybody agrees is permitted, and it spoke about mimatchen, which was a machlokes Rabbi Yossi and the Chachamim. We want to know what's misargin and what's mimatchen. Gemara has two versions of this. The first version is from Rav Dimi. Rav Dimi said it's a machlokes between Rav Chiya bar Amma and Rav Asi, both in the name of Rav Yochanan. One of them says that misargin means weaving the ropes. That means you interlace, you cross the ropes across the frame, both lengthwise and widthwise, both shasi and erev, the warp and the weft. And that's misargin. Mimatchen means you place just one way, just lengthwise, and not widthwise. Now the other explanation is that what we call mimatchen is really misargin, placing just ropes lengthwise and not widthwise. That's misargin. Mimatchen, which is machlokes, that is just pulling the ropes tight. That's not putting in ropes. That's just tightening the ropes that are there and they're already loose. Now the Gemara has a couple of questions on this. First of all, the Gemara says we have halacha where Rav Tachlifa bar Shol quotes a brayso, and he says that everybody agrees you're not allowed to twist new ropes in Chol HaMoed. So the Gemara says, if you already told me that you're not allowed to install ropes in the first place, then why would I need you to tell me that you cannot twist ropes? If you can't even install them, you certainly can't make them. And that's a kasha on the one therefore who says misargin means placing lengthwise and widthwise. So now I understand why you're allowed to, why I need the brayso to tell me that you cannot make the ropes in the first place. However, according to the other opinion, that you certainly cannot do lengthwise and widthwise, and the only discussion is about lengthwise versus tightening. So why would I ever think that you can make ropes? There shouldn't be any reason to discuss that. So the Gemara says that's a good kasha. The Gemara doesn't have an answer for that. Then the Gemara has another question, and the Gemara will actually reject one of the approaches. So the Gemara says, is it possible to say that misargin is placing the ropes lengthwise and not crosswise? But we have a Mishnah, which Rav Meir says that a bed is considered finished when you do yisroig, and yisroig, it's obviously the same as misargin, means when you make 3 squares. You have 3 squares because of the misargin. So therefore, it's obvious that sargin is when there are ropes going both ways, both lengthwise and widthwise. You cannot tell me that it refers to just going lengthwise. and therefore this cannot be the right explanation. So the Gemara says, you're right, we're going to reject that. And therefore, misargin being just lengthwise, nobody really holds that way. The two opinions really were as follows. Everyone agrees that misargin means to weave lengthwise and widthwise to make complete squares. The question is, what is memadchin? One says it means just lengthwise without widthwise, and the other says it means just to tighten it. So the Gemara says, but okay, I hear. So you're saying the only machlokes is about memadchin. We have a kasha on that as well, and that's as follows. You have a brisa that has a number of opinions as to whether or not you're allowed to do misargin and memadchin. So the first opinion is Rabbi Meir that says that both are permitted. Rabbi Yossi says memadchin is permitted, but misargin is forbidden, is usher. Then there's a Yesh Ayrim that says even memadchin is usher. Now the Gemara says if memadchin just means tightening the ropes, how could that possibly be usher? What would be wrong with tightening the ropes? That's how you sleep on the bed, so they shouldn't sag. So Gemara says no, because it's extra work. You don't really have to tighten it in order to be able to sleep on it. You could just pack more mattress, more cloth on top of it, and that would hold you up fine, and therefore there's no reason to do memadchin, and that's why this opinion says that it's usher, even though it just means tightening. Alright, now the Gemara quotes our next Mishnah, which discusses setting up certain devices. So Gemara says you're allowed to set up an oven or a stove. That is a clay enclosure in which you put a pot on top, a pot or two pots on top. You build a fire inside it and put a pot on top of it, and you cook it in that way. You're also allowed to set up millstones. And Rav Yehuda says you cannot do mechabshin to millstones. Now, let's describe millstones, and the Gemara will explain what mechabshin are. So, a millstones is a device used for grinding wheat kernels or other grain kernels. It was formed of two stones shaped like a disc. Each one was a disc, one on top of the other. There was a hole in the top one that you could pour the kernel so that it would slide between the two discs. And the discs had grooves on the surface where they met so that it would catch the grain and hold it. And then the top disc was turned by means of a stick that was moved by a donkey, and it would turn and would rub against the bottom and grind and crush any kernels that came in through the hole that you poured in on top. So what's mechabshin? So Yehuda says mechabshin means to cut those grooves in the stone so that it can grind. Rav Chil says it means to cut the hole that you can use to pour the grain in. You're not allowed to set these things up in the first place because that is creating a new millstone. You shouldn't be able to do that. Now, the Mishnah had said that you cannot set it up in the first place. So Gemara challenges Rav Yechiel's explanation. Rav Yechiel is the one who said that it means cutting a hole from a brisa. The brisa says you're allowed to set up an oven, a stove, and millstones, but you cannot finish the job. You cannot fully finish the job. That's according to Rabbi Eliezer. The Chachamim say you are allowed to finish the job. Now, Rabbi Yehuda said in the name of Rabbi Eliezer, you're allowed to set up a new millstone, but you cannot mechabshin an old one. And then there's the Yesh Ayrim that says you cannot mechabesh anyone, not a new one or an old one. Now, all these opinions are not necessarily needed for the Gemara's proof. The Gemara's proof is just on the fact that we say something about mechabshin in old millstone. According to Rabbi Yechiel, mechabshin means to make an eye hole. So that's the hole in which you pour the grain. Now, you have to do that in order to set the thing up in the first place. Why would you ever need to do it again? Why would you have to do it in an old millstone that's already been used? Now, the grooves, I understand. The grooves can get worn down and you have to scratch them out again. But the hole, what's the problem? So the Gemara says, no, it's not a problem. It could just mean widening the hole. It could be the hole wasn't big enough and you need to make the hole bigger, even if it was already a functional millstone before. Alright, now the Gemara has an incident here. The Gemara says that Rav Huna heard somebody cutting grooves in a millstone, and he said, who was this guy? May he be chulin, may his body be chulin, because he was mechalel chal hamayid. The Gemara says, obviously, Rav Huna holds like the Yesh Ayrim, that he say you're not allowed to cut any grooves in a millstone, not a new one or an old one. Because you just heard him, you didn't see what it was. Okay, now the Gemara says that Rav Chana was once giving a drasha, and he said you're allowed to cut grooves in a millstone and chal hamayid. And in Rabbi Meir we said that even that if you have a horse or a donkey that you ride, you're allowed to cut the hooves, the nails of the hooves of those animals, because otherwise it won't be able to walk and won't be functional. You won't be able to use it on chal hamayid. The hooves of the donkey that turns the millstone, you're not allowed to cut because it just has a short pace to walk, and it can walk. It can do that without having its hooves trimmed, and you don't need to do that. Now the Gemara brings an opinion that argues. This is Rav Yehuda. He says you are allowed to trim the hooves of the donkey that turns the millstone. You're allowed to set up the millstones. You're allowed to build a mill. You're allowed to set up the frame around these millstones, which holds all the grain in. And you're allowed to build a barn in Chol Moed. All these things are necessary for Chol Moed. You need them to prevent loss or to prevent or to help you for Chol Moed needs. Now, the Gemara has a list of more halachos. The Gemara says, the Rav says you're allowed to brush horses with a metal comb. They need that for the health. You're allowed to build a barn for your horses, for your animals. And you're allowed to build a stone seat, a place for people to sit that's required for Yom Tov. It's not also a major activity. You can just lay a couple of stones on each other. And now the Gemara lists 8 halachos said by Rava. In many of them, he compares 2 ways of doing the same activity, and I'll tell you how to tell which one's permitted and which one's forbidden. So, Rava's first halacha is that you're allowed to do bloodletting for an animal on Chol Moed. The Gemara says you can see this in a brisa as well. It says you're allowed to bloodlet an animal, and you don't withhold any medical care of an animal on Chol Moed. You're allowed to treat the animal. The Chol Moed does not prevent it, even if it involves malacha. Now, Rava's second halacha is that you're allowed to iron clothing because it's an amateur activity. The Gemara interjects. Rav Yitzchak bar Ami said you're allowed to pleat sleeves. You can iron pleats into a sleeve on a Chol Moed, and the reason is because he said you're not allowed to iron pleats on a Chol Moed, and the reason is because that's a Maisa Uman, that's a professional activity that requires a skill. Now, back to Rava. Rava said the third halacha is that you're allowed to clear things off your land, little mounds of dirt off your land, only if your point is to make a threshing floor. That's the place where you want to crush grain that you're going to use on Chol Moed. If you intend on clearing it so that you can plant, that's like plowing, preparing earth for planting, which is forbidden on Chol Moed. Now, how can you tell whether the person is clearing because he wants to make a threshing floor or clearing because he wants to plant? So the Gemara says it depends whether he's completely leveling it by placing a mound in a hole so that you end up with both even, or he's placing a mound on a mound or a hole on a hole. Machlokes Rishonim had to understand this. Rashi's explanation is that he doesn't flatten the mound, he just kind of makes it a little bit lower by scattering it. Still uneven, but it's flatter, so that's useful for threshing but not for plowing. And with the hole also, he kind of breaks down the walls of the hole so that it becomes not a sharp drop. Again, it's not perfectly flat, not perfectly level, but he does get rid of some of the unevenness, and therefore it's more useful. Okay, Rava's fourth halacha is that you're allowed to clear branches and twigs off your land in Chol Moed as long as you want to use it for firewood. If you want to make your land plantable, of course that's forbidden, and how could you tell? If you take only the big ones, then you probably just want it for firewood. If you take the big and small, then you're trying to clear the land. Now, Rava's fifth halacha is that you're allowed to direct water onto your property if you're trying to catch fish that'll come with the water. You're not allowed to do it if you plan on watering the ground. How could you tell? If you also open an outlet for the water to flow back into the water, then you obviously just wanted it to pass through so you can get fish. If you don't open an outlet, then you want it to water the ground, and therefore that's forbidden. Rava's sixth halacha, you're allowed to take branches from a palm tree if you're doing it for animals to eat, but not if you're doing it to improve the tree. How can you tell? If you take it all from one side, it's for animals to eat. You take it from both sides, then it's improving the tree. Seventh halacha is that you can cut unripe dates from a tree or cut in half. Machlokes what that means. But you're not allowed to press them under weights. Rav Papa says you are allowed to press them, and that's in order to dry them out, because otherwise they'll be wormy and become ruined. It's like anything where you're allowed to do things to prevent the loss and the destruction of those things. And Rava's eighth halacha is that you're allowed to do business on Chol Moed. You're allowed to buy merchandise. Yossi bar Avin says, Rava says, it is usher to buy the merchandise. If Yossi bar Avin says you are allowed to buy it if it's something that you're going to lose. You have an opportunity to buy something and it's going to be lost, then you're allowed to go ahead and grab the deal while it's still available. So Gemara says that Ravina had merchandise which was being sold, and the price in Chol Moed spiked to 6,000 zuz, which is a tremendous high profit. But he waited until after Chol Moed, and he ended up selling it for 12,000 zuz. Another story with the Ravina that he had a claim against the people who live on the edge of the Shanvasa River. He came before Rav Ashi and he said, could I ask them to pay me today? Today they're there, I can grab them. Can I go ask them today? Or is it us on Chalmite? So he said, well, since you can do it now and you won't be able to do it later, then you are allowed to go do it. It's considered to be something which you're going to lose.